Thank you all for being here. I'm Claire Howard. I'm the Assistant Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art here at the Blanton, and I'm very excited to be welcoming Jory Minaya for an artist talk in conjunction with our presentation of her video Labadee, which is upstairs in our video gallery across the way through December 8th. I'll give just a quick little intro and then let Jory take it from there. So, Jory Minaya is a Dominican United Statesian multidisciplinary artist whose recent work focuses on destabilizing historic and contemporary representations of an imagined tropical identity. Minaya attended the Escuela Nacional de Artes Visuales in Santo Domingo, the Altos de Chavannes School of Design, and the Parsons the New School for Design. She participated in residencies at Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, Gutenberg Arts, Macmillan, the Bronx Museum's AIM program, and the NYFA mentoring program for immigrant artists. Minaya is currently a Lower East Side print shop keyholder artist and a Socrates Sculpture Park Emerging Artist Fellow, and has been... Sorry, that was last year.
Yes.
Okay.
Earlier this year.
She's had many more exciting residencies since then, and has been awarded grants by the Joan Mitchell Foundation, the Rima Hort Mann Foundation, and the Nancy Graves Foundation. Minaya's work is in the collection of the Museo de Arte Moderno and the Centro Leon Jimenez in the Dominican Republic. And thank you all for being here again. Please join me in welcoming Jory.
Thank you all for coming, and thanks Claire for the introduction and also for curating the show here and inviting me here. I also wanted to thank the Blanton Museum for the opportunity and the team that installed my show. So I'll read a short statement and then I'll move on to the rest. My work is a reassertion of self, an exercise of unlearning, decolonizing, and exercising imposed histories, cultures, and ideas. I make interdisciplinary work that explores the performativity of tropical identity as a product, the performance of labor, decoration, beauty, leisure, service, and the body within it all. It's about reconciling the experience of having grown up in the Dominican Republic with living and navigating the U.S. global north, using gaps, disconnections, and misinterpretations in representation as fertile ground for creativity. I've learned there's a gaze thrust upon me which others me. I turn it upon itself mainly by seeming to fulfill its expectations, but instead sabotaging them, thus regaining power and agency. So, I was born in New York. I grew up in the Dominican Republic. I came back in 2011 when I got a scholarship to attend Parsons. I grew up going to New York and spending some of my summers there, but most of my growing up was in the DR, and I didn't live in New York until I was 21. This video is an exploration of my first years living there in like 2011, 2012. Looking at the landscape around me in Washington Heights, which is a very Dominican neighbor in the upper Manhattan part of the city, and it has like, it uses double exposure to impose footage from the DR and photos of people, images of people. And this is 1 minute excerpt of a 3.5 minute video. So I wanted to also show another old piece that I did around the same time, or actually the year before, when I just moved in. I went out and asked people in the city to write on index cards what they thought or perceived from me, from an impulse of not really understanding how I was perceived in this new location. You know, like when you're in a place, you understand how certain clothes you wear or like ways you speak mean some things to people, and I was just really lost at how people perceive me. So I went in the subway or like waiting for a doctor in the hospital or wherever people were sitting that they couldn't run away from me, and ask them to write on an index card what they thought of me. And I had a little box where they would put it, and I would assure them I wouldn't read it in the moment, and I wouldn't know who wrote what. In 2014, I made this piece called Siboney. it's, sorry, I forgot to put my timer, so I don't forget. Siboney, I did this piece around the time that tropical shirts were kind of coming back into fashion. I was in school. I mean, I did this piece after school, but when tropical shirts were coming out back in fashion, I was in school here, and I went wearing one to class, and someone greeted me with, ooh, tropical, and then they did this like shimmy thing. And I'm sure it was like a very, just a way to make conversation, but that kind of stuck with me as this kind of expectation of performativity. And later that kind of, that was something that I got to unpack for this piece. So this piece comes out of me finding a piece of fabric that had this pattern also while in school, but my thesis was already developed and my work was very different from this. So this wasn't really gonna make it in there, but right after I graduated, I went to Skowhegan and I took this piece of fabric with me and I put it on the wall and I took photos of it and try to deconstruct it on my computer, cutting out every little piece of leaf, flower, whatever. And separately, I was inviting men to the green screen room to respond to a song and seeing how they would move to the song and recording them without me being there. I would just close the door and have them dance. And then later on, what came out of all of that, I guess, exploration was this video. This is a 3-minute excerpt of 10-minute one-channel adaptation of a 16-minute two-channel video, in which I am copying the pattern that I found on a piece of fabric onto the museum wall. And it's all kind of recorded in this video that also, well, I'll let you see it and then I'll talk about it. So that was a short excerpt. As I said, this piece documents the process of painting the wall, and it references the idea of creation from scratch with the pigment mixing or the egg tempera or just the egg as a symbol in general. I'm thinking about gender within representation, who's been behind the brush and who represents it, who represents who and in what way. And particularly thinking of the archetype of the mulata within the Caribbean and the stereotypes and ideas that are projected onto this brown body and how it's paired with representations of landscape, which is a theme that I go back to a lot. So this is a painting that was at the museum at the time that I went to do that. And there's actually some shots of the painting that made it into the video, but you didn't see that in the trailer because I think it's not in the trailer. Just like an interesting coincidence that was there because it speaks a lot to my piece. This is called Ridicode. A tropical theme is a great way to create a fresh, peaceful, relaxing atmosphere. Ridicode is a word that I invented, and the rest is a phrase that I found from interior design blog. So this piece appropriates Don Lauper's design that he did for the redecoration of the Beverly Hills Hotel in 1942. The original wallpaper, you might recognize it. There's further out in the next slides, there's going to be some references to it because it's been produced a lot. It's a design of big banana leaves that show a kind of romantic representation of the tropics at a moment when the U.S. has heavy military presence around a lot of tropical places like Hawaii, Guam, Central America, etc. So my, and also the original design follows a tradition of botanical illustrations, which were themselves colonial tools to assess newfound resources, in the sense that it's very concerned with visibility and like a high level of detail. Like this type of representations were very into, you could see the design and you can tell what kind of plant you're seeing and all the little features of it, which also like with the way that the banana leaves are organized in space against a white background is like another shared characteristic of this wallpaper and this type of wallpaper with botanical illustrations, where you have like a plant that is like taken from decontextualized and put in a white space. So I kind of wanted to bring this back to an idea of foliage, in the sense that when you're seeing foliage in the real world, you see like different layers, you can't tell what plant is what, but also mess up with visibility, because visibility was like such an important tool for such an important colonial tool. So, and then in the process of pixelating this, it kind of ends up looking like, there's QR codes that are embedded into the wallpaper, and then those take you to a number of references. When you scan them, it will take you to this type of thing. Individually, not the whole collage, but things like Banana Republic and Wikipedia, but also Banana Republic, the store selling you their Explorer collection, and products that have that pattern, that type of pattern, phrases of books that I was reading. This insane book called Perfect Phrases in Spanish for Gardening and Landscaping, from a series of books that also has perfect phrases in Spanish for construction workers, childcare, and something else. And then images of the military wearing the pixelated uniform, which is what I was going to say that the wallpaper ends up referencing after being pixelated. So the original design is none of what you're seeing here. This is all kind of copies of it, but you probably recognize it. Similarly, this is called La Dorada, or Ridicode 2. It was shown at the Miller Theater lobby at Columbia University this year. And it's a similar strategy, except that the original source is this wallpaper that was designed by Zuber in the, I don't know if they designed this one in the 1700s, but the company started in the 1700s. It's a French wallpaper company that's still functioning today. It's like super expensive wallpaper, like museum collection expensive wallpaper. And I was interested in this, in El Dorado, the original design that they have, because it's kind of like a mapping of the world. It's like this panoramic design where you can see all the continents of the world, except I forgot about Oceania. But they have the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Europe. And then when you see the landscape, you have like this kind of, you can't really see yourself entering the landscape, if you know what I mean, in most of the continents except for Europe, which has like a little staircase and then a platform, an elevator platform for you to see the rest of the world. So in my version of it, Europe has like its own thing on, like, apart from the rest of this, and it's all pixelated. That's a little detail of it. Tropticon is a piece that was just installed last year up until May of this year at Socrates Sculpture Park in New York. Huh? In New York, yeah. And similarly trying to obfuscate visibility through pixels. And the original photos are photos that I took at the New York Botanical Garden greenhouses. And then I printed them on this like one-way visibility vinyl, which is the same that they use for buses when you're like inside the bus and you have like advertisement outside and you can see from the bus inside out. So it's the same effect. When you're standing inside Tropticon, you can see the landscape around you, but from outside you can't see who is inside. And I'm thinking about like sabotaging the idea of what you expect to find inside a greenhouse in the global north, where like instead of tropical plants, it offers the site-specific landscape for you to see. And I'm also thinking about a place of solace and shelter from these projections that I'm concerned with. And at the same time, it also works as a panopticon, so when you're standing in there, you can see all around you and then no one can see you. So back to the body. This is a Google search for Dominican women images. And from this Google search, I did this Google search when I was doing Siboney as research. And I was interested in looking up Dominican women in English, not in Spanish, because I was thinking of like, how do we present ourselves to the outside world, since we speak Spanish. So these are some of the collages that I did initially, kind of exploring that bank of images that I found and trying to think of like new ways of recomposing the body from those bodies. Later I did things more like this, where like the bottom ones are thinking of like camouflage and blending in with the landscape, but then thinking of like the frame landscape already framed by the photo, but also the landscape represented in this tropical designs. And it ends up looking like camouflage. I think I already said that. And this is just something I'll reference further on for another body of work. A third direction in the same collage 2D exploration was looking at, so when I clicked on some of the photos from the Google search, it will take me to websites for men who wanted to date a Dominican woman on their vacation. And it had a section of like men posing with the women that they met. So I took the photos of the men posing, and I started like a branch of this collages where I would like erase the women and just highlight the men. And then I kind of see that in conjunction with this direction where I'm looking at art history paintings, particularly Gauguin, Grau Araujo, Vela Zanetti, the guy that I showed earlier, is also in there. And I'm using images of the Google search and collaging the bodies in the painting with these images. kind of thinking of like how this representation is really old and an archetype in art history of like white men representing women of color. And this is kind of explorations of landscapes made of bodies. I'm not too much into this branch of this, but it actually led me to another artwork that came out of this Google search, which I'll talk about in a minute. So yeah, this is a branch that I'm still working on. And so I printed this into postcards, and I surreptitiously dropped them in gift shops when I traveled to the tropics. And they have my email in the bag. No one has emailed me. I wish someone did. You can buy them $3 for $1 or $50 each. I hope someone bought them. So this is the other work that came out of that process. It's called Dominican Women Google Search, hashtag Dominican Women Google Search, all in one word. And it's thinking of the idea of like recombining these body parts, but not in like an aesthetic way, but in a way where like they're, freely moving and creating new bodies and like deconstructing them. So when I blew up the cutouts of the original collages, the pixels in the photos became enhanced, and I started cutting out the edges of some of them, following those pixels to like reinforce that aspect of them. And then the back side is covered with actually some tropical shirts from thrift stores that I was really very pleased to cut up in pieces to put in here. And that's installed at Wave Hill in the Bronx in New York. And there are about 80 pieces so far. So this body of work is called Containers. It's staged photos, and it actually comes off the postcards that I said that I was gonna reference back, of like the covering of the body with this pattern. But now in a three-dimensional form, I sewed this bodysuits and got myself in them, and got my sister and my partner to take photos of me in landscapes. And eventually, like a theme of like constructed landscape also emerged. So the first one was taken at a natural hotel that we visited. So I'm lying on like concrete, and the plants are on planters, but it looks kind of natural. So I became interested in landscape also being constructed, or like man-made landscape that is presenting itself as natural. Similar with this one was taken at Wave Hill in the Bronx. And they started kind of looking more back into the poses from the women that I found on the Google search posing. So I started looking at those photos and like classifying the way that they pose, and finding the poses that repeated the most, and then kind of sewing the bodysuit to make the performer or whoever wear them inhabit that pose when they put it on. And then eventually this became a performance series. This one was at Socrates Sculpture Park, and the second one was at Wave Hill, both in New York. And for the performance, similarly, the performer is inhabiting the bodysuit, the pose when they put on the bodysuit. But thinking about elements of like time and like audience, what's that word? Interaction. I added some things to it. So there's an audio track that is playing from like a concealed speaker within the bodysuit that has like pre-recorded scripts of mostly my writing, also some appropriated text that I found. And the logic of the performance is that when the audio is playing, the performer is wearing the bodysuit, and when it's not, it has like inserted pauses in there. The performer can take it off and stretch and talk to people and whatever, and then when it's playing back on, you have to put it on and like perform. So it's also kind of underlying labor and performativity. This is an excerpt of a video.
Camouflage, or how to lose your native accent in 5 quick steps. Whenever you forget, there will be someone there to remind you, diligently pointing out your difference. You can pretend to think about all sorts of universal things, but a stare, a tone, a question about your providence, or a damn will bring you back to your brown, female, perceivably foreign body. Having the mental space to fantasize about gardens and hikes in the universe is a privilege.
Morisot went back to France. He used some of the renderings of flowers he extracted from his expedition as the basis for textile designs.
The dynamic of strangeness within the frame of familiarity construct the exotic, and yet the exotic is always in danger of losing its alien quality as it becomes domesticated.
Age 26, edible parts, rhizome, language, Spanish, kingdom, plante.
I'm not the motherland. I'm not the landscape. I'm framing this composition. I'm not a flower. I'm only here to work. I'm here to entertain you, but only during my shift. So this is a photo of the first performance at Socrates Sculpture Park. And then the script for this bodysuit in this area of the park was about, it's actually this one here. It uses like, so when I clicked on the images of the women and found the online catalogs, the way that they're displayed is like a photo of the woman and then information. So you have like name, age, how many kids she has, what languages she speaks, measurements of her body and all of that. And because I was looking at plant books at the same time, it looked very similar to the way that you have like a plant and like all of this information. So the script for this bodysuit is kind of exploring that interchangeability of women and landscape in that particular avenue. And then what you're seeing next to it is the layout of the plants of one area of Wave Hill that I was looking at for designing this whole thing. So like this, the documentation for this body of work I've shown in like different ways. So sometimes I show the video, sometimes I print the images and excerpts of the text. So here you have like some of those. And then that leads into the work that we're showing here and the more kind of installation part of my work. So this is like the first spandex installation I ever made. I was invited to a show in the Bahamas under a curatorial frame of like, they show the work of local artists paired with the work of broader Caribbean diaspora artists. And I was paired with Dee Brown, and when we were talking about the exhibition, first I was very interested in showing Labadee because I had just finished editing it, and because the Bahamas is such a similar place to what you see in that video, in the sense that the access to space is very constructed around, not everyone has access to the same spaces. You have a lot of like heavily guarded touristic spaces, or like expat villages, which, you know, I don't know what the difference is between expat and immigrant, but they use that word. Expat, like private villas, which are near the touristic complexes. So the local Bahamian people can't really enter those spaces in the same way that other bodies can. So thinking about access and this kind of inside-outside idea, and also talking to Dee, she told me something about my bodysuits that made me think further about this material. So she said that looking at the images of the bodysuits, it was like a very vicarious experience, in the sense that you would see the performer, but you wouldn't like necessarily, you're imagining what it feels to be constrained within this material through seeing it. And that made me think, well, what if I can offer like a more tangible experience of this material? And it all came together in this wall. This is different shots of like what's going on behind and in front of the wall. And I have this really funny video. So this guy was in the gallery and I told him to go to the other side of the wall so I could record him and have some recording of like the use of the wall. And he did all of this acrobacy, which was wonderful. But the idea behind the wall was to make it somehow uncomfortable, or at least like outside of the usual, making an experience like outside of the usual to enter a space. Yeah. And that's what went on there. Oh, there's more. Oh, okay. You can get inside the wall too. Okay. So another version of that was in Detroit at Red Bull House of Art when I made a cube for show in Laba D. And this was less concerned with all of the different, acrobacies that people could do to get in, and rather more interested in making an immersive experience. So this is what you see when you get in. And it's also the first time that I started using lounging chairs, like plastic lounge chairs, to invite the audience to sit in and kind of bodily inhabited space that's similar to what you're seeing in the screen. And yeah, this is kind of the version that's more inspiring what happened here. I'm also kind of excited to so the version of Laba D that is here, I couldn't come to install myself, so it's also the first time that I had to like give remote instructions to a team to install it, and they added a more kind of solidness to the installation, which I'm really happy about because it kind of informs now a broader vocabulary for future installations. Yeah, I'm thinking of like labyrinths and things that you can climb or whatever. I don't know what this is gonna turn into, but I'm excited about that aspect. This is a still image of Laba D. If you haven't seen it, I invite you to see it after this. I didn't put a trailer in here, but basically Laba D happened because my mom wanted to go on a cruise with my family, and I lived in New York, and they live in the Dominican Republic, so it was a good opportunity to see them, but also sounded like a good opportunity for research, so I brought my camera, and that's how that ended up happening. But it was definitely like very stark in the sense that from all the places that the cruise stop, it's the only place that is fenced off, and that what they advertise is like a day at the beach, as opposed to like allowing you to take a taxi and go visit a museum or do whatever within the 6 hours that the cruise is like in a place. Also in the Bahamas, they have this statue of Christopher Columbus. And because our show was opening on October 12th, I was like, we have to wrap this. And they didn't let me. So this is a Photoshop rendering of my wrapping. They said that they didn't let me because I think it was at the time that in the US and around the world, they had like a lot of challenging of like all of these statues and colonial statues. And they didn't want to they mentioned something about like not ready for that conversation. So I was like, okay, I'll print it in postcards and invite the people to tell me what they think about this idea. And so I have like, I can't remember how many, but I think there are like 80 or 70 postcards of people that responded to it. And you have all sorts of things. My favorite is the one in the middle that says dominance concealed by tropical beauty. Perhaps the statue is a reminder of the political reality we are subject to. But then you have all sorts of things from like, history is what it was, the past cannot be changed, let it be. And Nancy wanted me to know that she was from the US. And also cover the fuckers. So it's like a pretty wild and wide range of responses. And then most recently, last year, I started this series called I Can Wear Tropical Print Now, which also goes back to that story of the tropical shirt and kind of responds to, so I don't wear tropical print anymore for ages, but this is me kind of thinking to myself what this tropical print would need to have in order for me to wear it. So this one has like, this one has all of these photos from like cruises, U.S. Navy ships, galleons, and expensive yachts, kind of like all going into this deserted island pattern. And then this one has the date of the second U.S. Invasion in the Dominican Republic, which is also the date of my mom's birth. This one has little T-pins that are painted onto the flowers, and little like blood drops that are painted there. I don't know if you can see them. They're like really small, but they're painted throughout the whole shirt. And this one says opacity. It's this one here. So it's also interesting because I'm pairing spandex fabric that I used to use for the bodysuits with shirts that come from all sorts of like production processes. So some of them are vintage from like a time that they were printed in cotton and printed through this like multiple layer color application, as opposed to like designed in the computer and printed digitally. But what's interesting is how they echo each other still, and that was something that I was playing with in this kind of camouflage way. And then the opacity one is the most successful in that sense. Opacity is a chapter of the book Poetics of Relation by Edouard Glissant, and he is talking about opacity as kind of defending the right to opacity as opposed to, or as solace from a never-ending demand for transparency and legibility. And then this is my last work that I'll talk about. It has a lot of moving parts. It's called Mango Slice, slash The King's Wife. It was performed at the Brooklyn Museum and also at the African American Museum of Philadelphia. And it's me, so I have all of these props. I have a bunch of mangoes that I'm peeling throughout. It's a lecture performance, kind of like this, where I'm presenting images and talking, and I'm reading. These are some of the images that I show in that performance. On that side, you have like a family photo, and on this side, you have The King's Wife painting by Gauguin, and who is surrounded by mangoes. And I'm thinking of mango peelers, women who were photographed during a particular time as like, typical street sellers, women who were painted and found images online. And I'm reading these like personal narratives of like my experience growing up with mangoes around me, and my family, women in my family eating mangoes, and there's some play with words and what's going on in the text. So like, for example, when I talk about my sisters, I show you an image. I show you this image, and then I say my sisters again, and I show you a different image, and it has kind of some glitchy parts like that where I'm trying to play with language and images and the meaning of them being paired. What else? There's many different aspects and parts of this. I'm working on a script right now to try to produce this as a video performance lecture, so I don't have to try to explain it. I can just show you a trailer of it in the future. And it ended with me giving out the mangoes so the mangoes that I was peeling, I was doing it with gloves and cutting it in pieces and putting it in Ziploc bags, kind of inhabiting this mango seller persona. And I end up the performance giving that away to the public, to the audience. I'm also reading some parts of Gauguin's Noah Noah book where he talks about how women want to be forced upon and a bunch of other things. Yeah, so it's diverse work. Okay. Thank you.
And we have about 15 minutes for questions if anyone wants to. Yes.
So I was really taken aback by a couple of ideas that I really love because as a Caribbean woman, we actually share the same island on the other side of the island. I think Caribbean women actually have this very sensual, great way of telling you to like fuck off. And there's this, it doesn't get presented with the romance that is actually attached to it. You know, there's a romantic way that they do it. And I found like the piece where you were using your own body to disrupt the pattern that you had created or reinvent another statement on it. I thought that that was like physically one of the kind of more poignant ways to describe that attitude. That there still is this brushing, and even the statement. What was it? It was.
I'm not here for you.
Yeah, I'm not here for you. But there's a dance to it. And I just wanted to kind of like get some insight on your experience watching women activate that growing up, and why you felt compelled to present it that way.
Sure. Well, when you were talking, I was thinking a lot of like women in my family, and for sure that's an aspect of it. I myself have like a ambivalent relationship with that. I don't know, presence or performativity or ways of being. Because I guess I want to access my own, pleasure and sensuality. And at the same time, I don't want to be co-opted by or perform for or be like consumed by a gaze that I'm not interested in. So I'm always kind of ambivalent about that. And I think that ambivalence is also part of what informs that piece. Because, I'm definitely inhabiting that persona for the moments that I'm dancing. At the same time, I'm like undoing all of this representation. So that's definitely there. Women growing up. I think that's what I think about that. I feel like I want to talk more, but like I had some idea and it slipped away. Thank you for your comments, though.
You mentioned Edward Glissant, and I sense a lot of allusions to, say, like Jamaica Kincaid or like other thinkers of the ideas that you're dealing with. And you also obviously write and incorporate writing and appropriate text as well. So I'm just interested in the relationship with like reading and writing and like how that gets either cannibalized or inspires some of your work or then gets produced in the form of text and just like the role of text in
I miss reading a lot. I feel like I don't have a lot of time to read anymore, but I keep buying books compulsively on Amazon that I don't get to read. I think the desire to read more is there, and I keep pulling from things that I've read in the past that have been very striking to me, like Glissant. I haven't spent a lot of time with Jamaica Kincaid. It's in my shelf. It's one of those books that I need to read that I haven't. Several. And I think writing for me came from wanting to explain things in like a more, I think art is great in being kind of like, you can have multiple interpretations of it, but I wanted things to be more direct at some points of this work before, because they play with that idea of that ambivalence that I mentioned, when like, someone can see it and see, some like nice flowery decoration, whatever, or like the bodysuits that I'm making. I'm seeing some things that look like that in fashion these days, and so I kind of wanted to be more direct to the direction that directing the audience to reading some of my things in a particular way through those texts. Yeah, I so look forward to having some time to read. Just like reading for a month or a year.
Do you, I'm interested in your process. Do you actually sew the bodysuits
I do.
yourself?
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. So how do you get them right? How did you,
I have
how many iterations of them are there until you get the
Well,
way you want it?
because I only do one per pose. That's only one iteration. But to get to that one, it definitely goes through like a lot of sewing, especially because I am not a seamstress by any means, and I'm sure if someone who is a fashion designer or a seamstress sees my bodysuits, they'll be like pretty. I don't know. It would be scandalous, but. I think I do them good for the photo and for the performance. I'm working on my skills to make them good, but it's also hard because I can't just copy a piece of, clothes that already exists because I'm working with particular poses. I have a mirror in my studio and I put it on and take it off and just try, go back to the sewing machine. That's another thing on my list, taking a class for sewing. Yeah.
You said when you were talking about the 2014 work that was on display here in Austin at Mexearte this summer. So I got to see it there, and some people got to see it in the show.
Yeah, the Siboney.
Siboney. Yeah,
Mhm.
was on display in Austin this summer. And you said it references the idea of creation from scratch. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah,
The process of
mhm. Well, I was thinking about just all the men that get to represent women in this variety of ways, and then maybe creation from scratch in the sense of a new canon or a new direction for those representations that is not I struggle a lot with the idea of do I perform this thing that is expected, or do I go in a whole other direction and look into the expansive universe that I can be outside of all of this identity crisis issues. But then I feel that if I do this, I'm not really speaking to this, and this is never going to stop happening. So my way of marrying the two is kind of inhabiting this and then kind of sabotaging it from within so far. And I guess when I say creating from scratch, well, that doesn't sound from scratch because I'm talking about something that already exists. But for that particular piece, it had to do with the idea of the blank wall and what do you fill it with, but also referencing a very old history of painting. And that's what I meant with the pigments and the egg yolk and using all of these dated ways of painting that you can just get paint out of a tube now. It was also at the same time convenient because I had to paint a whole wall, and that would have been much more expensive if I get tubes. So with pigments I could do my own, but also very intentionally thinking about that history and kind of as a woman inhabiting that history.
I was interested in your use of the tourist sort of postcard. I thought that was really an interesting part of your work, and I'm just curious, you showed ones, I think you said it was from a show in the Bahamas where you had wrapped or photoshopped the Christopher Columbus statue, and I'm just curious how you display those or think about displaying those or circulate them, because you showed a couple of images where you clearly had them as part of an art installation, but I was curious if the works that you showed with the children's response, is that an archive you kept for yourself, or have you actually displayed the comments? Is it a work of art? I'm just sort of curious how they exist in the world.
Yeah. Wait, what children?
Kids and adults who wrote on the back of them. Sorry, I think some of the responses maybe were from kids and some from adults.
Oh,
Sure.
okay. For the postcards of Columbus.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know if there was any kids, but maybe. I don't, because I didn't witness the audience. Huh?
Terrible handwriting, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. No, I think there's some drawings there too. So maybe like those look. I don't know. I wasn't there to see everyone who like did a postcard, but yeah, I've shown that work, I think twice since I made it, and I usually show the document, like the postcards, not the front side of it, but the writing of it. And I have some blank postcards that I sometimes display in, like, you know, trying to like do that thing again where you have the postcards on the stand. I haven't shown them in the way that I'll say now, but I'm interested in showing them like this. I want to like print the image kind of as an image in itself, kind of large, and next to the documentation of it. So yeah, for that work, I'm just interested in displaying the documentation and what people say, and, you know, having like a label that explains what the action was. But also the image to me is interesting. I'm actually gonna get to wrap up Christopher Columbus statue in Miami in December, so stay tuned. Yeah.
I was curious about the piece with the hanging cutouts.
Uh-huh.
Whether people, do they move with their bodies through those pieces?
Yeah, they can. It depends on the installation. For that one, which was the first one, they did, because I did, like, it depends on how I install them. So like if I install them if I make those like spaces or like little holes or like areas where people can go in, they will do it because they're very curious and they want to like even like try it on or whatever. I've seen people taking photos of like a body part in front of them, which is really awkward for me, but looks really fun if I didn't know what the content was. So it gets to be awkward for me. Yeah, people really want to interact, kids especially. There's usually someone there trying to tell people not to touch the art as usual. But yeah, sometimes I haven't done it because of the space that I'm given to install it, and sometimes the space itself is not conducive for people to like, you know, go around it in that way, or they will be too close to the art and maybe, you know, not be aware of like damaging it with like a necklace or something that, you know, could scratch it or something. But yeah, sometimes I do that, and that's an aspect that I'm interested in the piece. But that piece for me is very flexible in the sense that I've even installed not all the 80 ones, not all of the 80 pieces, smaller groups like 10 or 15 or 20 or 40, because I think just one single piece kind of carries the gesture that I'm interested in for that piece, and the accumulation of it adds layers to it, and then the ways that it's presented also adds layers. So I'm very flexible with that piece in particular, but I'm very interested in that aspect when I can do it.
Hi, Jory. So I'm interested in two things. How you think your work is received in the Caribbean, because you seem to be really interested in the Caribbean audience and that space, and how it's received in the US and maybe other places outside the Caribbean. And I'm also interested in, I'm familiar with your work from kind of really moving through Caribbean networks. Like I know you had a show in Puerto Rico, this work about Haiti. So I'm also interested in how within the Caribbean, maybe different places have different responses. You know, the Bahamas has a particular relationship to Haiti, for example, so
Right.
people might respond in different ways across the Caribbean in different spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when I show it in the Global North, when I show it in the Caribbean, I think people see it more as like, well, they understand what's going on. They're very familiar with those dynamics. They see it more as like something, like I'm pointing at something that needs attention, and that they could have some sort of agency in, like, or maybe not, because also these are like pretty intense power dynamics that have to do with economics and things like that I don't know how much agency Caribbean people could have from that point of view for some of those situations. When I show it in the Global North, people, well, my aim is that people see themselves implicated and that they take wiser decisions when they partake in this, whatever, you know, I don't know, be it about like your ideas about Dominicanness or Dominican womanhood, or like your ideas about whether you're gonna get on a cruise or not, or like if you're gonna travel, if you're gonna look into the hotel where you're staying, or if you're gonna choose like a more local alternative. So I think maybe there's more agency on that side because of consumerism and you know, the power that consumers have in their choices. And also, I don't know, it's a two-part thing. So I'm trying to think of like, if I can tell how the work is received necessarily, because you put an exhibition up and you're not, you know, witnessing it unfolding throughout time. The ways that I can tell about feedback have to do with maybe people writing about my work when they see a show, or Dominican Women Google search, because the title is a hashtag, people upload it and I can track the photos that they upload if they use the hashtag. So there I have a more like direct sense of like how are people perceiving it. I don't know, and then there's also layers to it because a lot of my work is very, looks very colorful and decorative and superficial, and some people stay in that surface, and so some people go deeper, and depending also on like your investment in the work, there's different feedback. But I feel there's for sure a difference. I'm just trying to think of like how to put it into words. When I've been in my openings for these works in the Caribbean, I definitely hear people discussing the things that I'm trying to point fingers at, and trying to think of like the ways that they can have more agency in these things. Yeah.
I'm curious, I really am absorbed by the way that you add so much texture and materiality even to film installations. And I'm curious if you, like, just as a way of shaping and adding like a physical dimension to that visual experience. I'm wondering, like, once you added the sort of plastic lawn chairs, is that reinformed or changed the way you think about feature film installations possibly? Just having that sort of like really tactile, textural experience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for Lavadi for sure, I've been really like pushy after I first put the lawn chairs to have the lawn chairs everywhere always, because I feel it does add something different than just sitting in a regular bench for seeing that work. And yeah, I guess because my work is very interdisciplinary, you have that, or I have that impulse of trying to have like, what is that, like German movement of like everything together, Gesamtkunst or something? Yeah. So I have that. I don't have the capacity to always do something like that, but like when I can think of every little aspect of how my work is displayed, yeah, I'll definitely be into that. At the same time, I think Labadee can just be projected as a, you know, in a screening without all of that context, because I think the video itself it's pretty good standing on its own. But yeah, I think my work is very modular in that sense that like not all of it, but a big part of it can be shown in multiple ways. But I think it's definitely enriched when I have more control and budget to do yeah, more immersive installations.
I'm curious in your process as a filmmaker and what you're thinking about, particularly not only with the New York sort of film, but also with Labadee, and sort of your process in trying to map space and landscape for these areas.
Mm-hmm.
Can you repeat that?
How I'm curious about her process in trying to map space and landscape in these areas in which she's filmed.
Mm-hmm.
I guess your objective.
Yeah. I think the Lava D film is kind of very aware of this layer of, I don't know, this history of like films that were like anthropological films or like like showing you different geographies, like from the 70s and things like that. And I'm trying to play with that maybe lineage in the sense that I think my intentions are in conversation with those intentions in the way that it's also trying to flip some of that. The New York one, it was kind of like my first ever video, one of my first videos. So I'm trying to think of intentionality in 2011 for me. I think that one was just very straightforward, looking around my surroundings, but then also thinking of yearning and being elsewhere and like missing my homeland and overlapping those landscapes. And that was a lot of fun because it was with it was film, and I had to do double exposure for real as opposed to like digitally superimpose things. So I don't know, that definitely added like a tangible, tactile dimension to that, in the sense that you have to do it on the film. But yeah, I think my intentions are more clear in my recent work in that sense.
Thank you all so
Okay.
much.
Thank you.